name is Dr. Scott C. Core. I am a health service psychologist and the director of Renew Counseling Center, which is a part of Southern Nazarene University. And I'm also a professor in the graduate programs in counseling. And I'm joining you today for what we're calling Mental Health Minutes, which we're trying to make these kind of brief 10-minute digestible information sessions about different topics on mental health that we hope continues to help us understand why people get into some of the places that they get into for good and for bad. Today we're going to talk about dopamine and addiction. So I hope you enjoy this one. This is kind of setting the precursor for what I believe is a lot of addictive behaviors. It's built off of a lot of great research that exists out there. One of the ones that I'm going to quote today is Dr. Anna Lembke, who is a medical doctor who's done a really great presentation on kind of the dopamine hypothesis related to addiction. And essentially what Dr. Lembke says is addiction is either a problem in the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the front parts of our brains. And essentially some of the problem is that we cannot put the brakes on our desires. Or it could be a problem in kind of the more primitive parts of the brain called the nucleus accumbens or the ventral tegmental areas, which are big fancy terms for kind of those more primitive parts of the brain that are buried more deeply inside. And essentially what happens there is that things move too fast. We have too fast of an accelerator on desire, and thus we can't put the brakes on very well because that accelerator is going too fast. And a lot of this is related to dopamine. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, well, what is dopamine? Well, dopamine's a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's actually called the reward neurotransmitter. And it is a key role, it plays a key factor in how we experience pleasure and reward. And it's a common pathway for all of the reinforcing substances and behaviors that we would quantify as addiction. And understand that addiction can be a lot of things. I think we often think of it as substances, but it can be things like gambling, for example. It can be things like eating, for example. And so dopamine is one of the primary factors in a lot of what creates addictive behaviors. So what happens with dopamine in the brain? Well, dopamine is going to change in response to certain stimuli. So it's going to depend on how much dopamine is released given that particular stimulus. And that's the basis for how addictive a substance ultimately becomes for someone. Okay, so essentially, how addictive is something? Well, it depends on how much dopamine gets released by the stimulus entering into the brain. So there's a lot of different addictive substances, and it's really interesting. This research is pulled from what's called Dopamine Nation. It's a book on kind of finding that balance in dopamine. And it's got some research based off of some of the most addictive dopamine-releasing substances. Well, chocolate's one of those that is pretty addictive, but when you look at some of the other areas that actually are the most addictive, that releases the most dopamine, nicotine starts to be one of those that increases quite a bit. And then cocaine, obviously, is another one that gets up to almost 2,500% of dopamine release. Amphetamines being the largest dopamine releaser. And so you can see that you can get dopamine from all sorts of things. People get dopamine hits from pleasurable activities like eating and listening to music, which can actually be really helpful for attention deficits. But some of these other substances, like sex and nicotine and kind of the harder drugs, particularly amphetamines, release so much dopamine, and this is why they become so addictive in a lot of ways. So how does addiction work? Well, our brain wants to restore balance. It's homeostasis is what we call it. It's always trying to balance things out. And what stress does is it causes an imbalance right away. This is why mental health is often connected to addiction, is because stress can create a pretty quick imbalance in our brains. So we do something to increase dopamine to help us feel better, essentially. So we might overeat, or we might drink, or we might take a substance that we're trying to do to balance out the pain in some ways. The problem is, though, is if we keep pursuing that dopamine hit, pain actually doesn't go away, it multiplies. And so our pleasure set point gets changed. And this is kind of how we get into what we would call the addictive brain. And thus we have to have that drug of choice, not to get pleasure from it at this point, but to ultimately try to balance out the pain, to get to homeostasis. The problem, though, is pain's actually in control. And eventually we develop tolerance, and it takes more of that dopamine hit just to try to keep the pain at bay. And essentially what happens is the pleasure-pain process is broken at this particular point, okay? So how do we help? What do we do with the kind of like addicted dopamine brain? Well, one of the biggest things, and I know all have heard this, is exercise. Well, why does exercise help? Well, dopamine's important in movement, and it's essential in recovery. So movement has to be attached to the dopamine hits that we're getting. And this is why exercise helps so much. It cannot be sitting on the couch. It can't be looking at our phones. It has to involve active movement because that actually helps access dopamine in healthy ways. So essentially, Dr. Lemke says there's three kind of main things we want to do. Number one being abstain. Abstain from the dopamine hit that we're getting. And the research says it needs to be for at least 30 days. We have to identify the triggers. We've got to identify adaptive behaviors that can help us with the addiction, and we have to make a plan. Willpower is not enough, essentially. We have to really be structured to be able to abstain for at least 30 days to start to really see recovery start to happen. And then we have to maintain that. We have to create barriers against our dopamine hits. How do we keep ourselves from accessing them, okay? Where do we go to get away when we're struggling, okay? How do we look at how we organize our day to day and schedule times for indulgence, okay? Now, when I say indulgence, I don't mean that dopamine hit that we're used to getting. I mean something that is used as a tool that is more in line with our values. Essentially, the question becomes, would you let someone else look at that particular dopamine activity? Would you let them view it with you? That will tell you whether or not it's something that you are probably doing adaptively or whether it's something that's probably more in line with your addiction in some ways. And then this seems ironic, this last piece, we have to seek out pain, which doesn't sound intuitive. But what I mean by that is when we can access the things that hurt us, when we can press on that pain and stay until it balances out, that's how dopamine and pain starts to balance out a little bit. This is why therapy works. I go in and I talk about the things that are unconsciously in a lot of ways bothering me or even consciously bothering me so that I can access that pain and I can start to recognize that it doesn't have power over me. I have power over it. I'm not going to let it continue to dictate. And so things like exercise and prayer and fasting and meditation and therapy are all ways in which we kind of seek out the pain and we learn to regulate it differently. And then this activity, actually seeking out pain, releases dopamine in a different kind of healthy type of way, okay? And what it does is it right-sizes the pain for the individual. And you may feel worse before you feel better, but that's part of how we see healing start to happen. So what's our take-homes again today? Addiction is about dopamine levels in a lot of ways. Dopamine is one of the most addictive neurotransmitters, and it's a reward neurotransmitter, but we often overuse it. And it's the reward neurotransmitter. And addiction results from overindulgence in that dopamine. And it can create a balance and an imbalance in pain and pleasure. And so physical movement, abstinence, maintenance, seeking out the pain are ways in which we can start to balance those things out and start to get our brains back into a balanced center so that it's not taking over as much. Hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening.